The morning fog embraced the coastline of Oakford Bay, like a mother cradling her child, soft and protective yet concealing all that lay within its misty depths. It was in this ethereal shroud that Eleanor Hayes first appeared. Her slender form sprawled upon the wet sand, where the tide had deposited her sometime before dawn. The fisherman who discovered her in the early light might have mistaken her for driftwood, had it not been for the crimson scarf still knotted around her neck, a vibrant beacon against the muted palette of the shore. "She's breathing," muttered Samuel, the oldest of the fishermen, kneeling beside the unconscious woman. His weathered hands hovered uncertainly over her form, reluctant to touch what seemed so fragile. "Run for Dr. Whitman, Jonah. Quick now." As Jonah's footsteps faded into the fog, Samuel removed his woolen coat and gently laid it over the woman. Her face, partially obscured by strands of salt-encrusted chestnut hair, bore no visible injuries, yet the unnatural pallor of her skin spoke of ordeal. Her clothes, a once fine dress of deep blue cotton, were torn and saturated with seawater, clinging to her frame like a second skin. "Where'd you come from, miss?" Samuel whispered, though he expected no answer. The only response came from the waves, their rhythmic lapping against the shoreline a constant reminder of the sea's indifference to human suffering. Within the hour, Eleanor, though they did not yet know her name, had been transported to Whitman's clinic, a modest structure that served as doctor's office, pharmacy, and occasional hospital for the small coastal town of Oakford. Dr. Ethan Whitman, a man whose youthful appearance belied his 40 years, worked methodically to assess her condition, while his sister, Meredith, peeled away the sodden garments. "No fractures that I can feel," Ethan reported, his fingers carefully probing her limbs. "Some bruising along the ribs, minor abrasions on her hands and feet. Most concerning is her temperature. She's dangerously cold." Meredith, ever practical, had already begun heating bricks by the fire. "The clothes tell a story, brother," she observed, examining the waterlogged dress. "Quality fabric, careful stitching. This was no fisherman's daughter who fell from a local boat." Ethan nodded in agreement. No identification, though. Nothing in her pockets save for this. He held up a small object that glinted in the lamplight, a locket, tarnished by salt water but clearly made of silver. The clasp had been damaged, rendering it impossible to open without tools he didn't currently possess. "Perhaps it contains a portrait," Meredith suggested, "something to identify her when she wakes." "If she wakes," Ethan corrected grimly, placing a heated brick wrapped in flannel near the woman's feet. "She's survived the sea, but the body sometimes surrenders after the immediate danger has passed." Outside the clinic window, Oakford was coming to life. The fog was beginning to dissipate, revealing the modest collection of buildings that comprised the town centre. The general store with its wide porch, the post office adjacent to the telegraph office, the small stone church whose bell now rang to mark 8 o'clock. Few residents took notice of the activity at Whitman's clinic. Emergencies were common enough in a town where many made their living from the treacherous sea. By midday, word had spread of the mysterious woman found on the beach. Speculation ran rampant. She was a survivor of a shipwreck, though no vessels had been reported missing. A runaway bride? Her ring finger bore no marks of a recently removed band, or perhaps even a spy, though why a spy would choose Oakford, of all places, remained unexplained. The town's mayor, Edward Holloway, paid a brief visit to the clinic, more out of obligation than concern. "The town can cover her care for 3 days," he informed Dr. Whitman. "After that, if she remains unclaimed and unable to pay, she'll need to be transferred to the county poorhouse in Westham." Ethan's jaw tightened at the mayor's callousness, but he merely nodded. "Understood. I'll notify you of any changes in her condition." It was near dusk when Eleanor first showed signs of waking. Meredith, who had remained at her bedside while Ethan tended to other patients, noticed the subtle flutter of eyelashes, the slight change in breathing pattern. She leaned forward, watching intently as awareness slowly returned to the woman's features. "You're safe," Meredith assured her, keeping her voice low and gentle. "You're in Oakford. You were found on the beach this morning." Confusion clouded the woman's eyes that Meredith now noticed were an unusual shade of amber, flecked with gold. Her lips, still tinged with blue, parted as if to speak, but only a hoarse whisper emerged. "Water." Meredith helped her sip from a ceramic cup, supporting her head with a steady hand. "There now. Easy. You've had quite an ordeal." The woman sank back against the pillows, her gaze darting around the unfamiliar room. Fear flickered across her features. followed by something deeper, a profound bewilderment that transcended simple disorientation. "Can you tell me your name?" Meredith asked, reaching for the slate where she had been recording observations. The woman's brow furrowed in concentration, her fingers clutching at the blanket as if the physical sensation might anchor her to some elusive memory. She began, then stopped, her expression transforming from confusion to distress. I can't remember." Meredith set down her slate, concern etching new lines around her eyes. "It's all right. Sometimes after a shock, memories can be temporarily misplaced. They often return in time." But the woman was becoming increasingly agitated, her breathing rapid and shallow. "No, you don't understand. I can't remember anything. Not my name, not where I'm from, not how I ended up on your beach." Tears welled in her amber eyes. "Why can't I remember? What happened to me?" Meredith took her trembling hand, squeezing it gently. "Hush now. You need rest more than answers at the moment. My brother is the doctor here. He'll examine you properly when he returns. Until then, we'll call you." She hesitated, searching for something appropriate. "Eleanor, after my grandmother. Would that be acceptable, just until your own name returns to you?" The woman nodded weakly, exhaustion already reclaiming her despite her distress. "Eleanor," she repeated, testing the name on her tongue as if trying to determine whether it fit. "Yes, for now." As Eleanor drifted back into sleep, Meredith moved to the window, watching as lanterns were lit across Oakford, tiny constellations against the gathering darkness. The mystery of the woman from the sea would wait until morning, but Meredith couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor's arrival heralded changes for their quiet town, changes as inevitable and powerful as the tides themselves. 3 days passed, and Eleanor remained at the clinic, her physical strength returning more rapidly than her memories. Dr. Whitman had diagnosed her with retrograde amnesia, likely caused by trauma to the head, though the injury itself had left no visible mark. He explained this to Mayor Holloway when the official arrived to inquire about the patient's status, precisely 72 hours after his first visit. "So she claims to remember nothing?" Holloway asked, skepticism evident in his tone as he stood near the clinic entrance, reluctant to approach the curtained alcove where Eleanor rested. "She remembers how to speak, how to eat with utensils, how to read the passages Meredith has shown her," Ethan explained. "Her procedural memory remains intact, but personal details, her name, family, home, those remain inaccessible to her." The mayor's thin lips pressed together in disapproval. "Convenient, wouldn't you say? A strange woman appears from nowhere, unable to account for herself or pay for her care." Ethan bristled at the insinuation. "If you're suggesting she's feigning her condition—" "I suggest nothing," Holloway interrupted, raising a placating hand. "Merely noting that the situation leaves the town in an awkward position. As agreed, her allotted time here has expired. Arrangements for her transfer to Westham should be made immediately." Behind the curtain, Eleanor sat motionless on the edge of her bed, listening to the men discuss her fate as if she were a parcel to be redirected. The poorhouse at Westhamshire had overheard enough conversations to understand what such a place entailed. The prospect filled her with dread, not simply for the conditions she might endure, but for the finality it represented. To be sent away, categorized and shelved as a person without identity, seemed to guarantee her memories would never return. She glanced down at the locket in her palm, its silver surface now cleaned of corrosion thanks to Meredith's careful attention. Despite their efforts, the damaged clasp had proven stubborn, the locket's contents remaining a tantalizing mystery. Eleanor traced its engraved surface with her fingertip, an intricate pattern of waves surrounding a single 5-pointed star. Did this symbol hold meaning for her? Was it a family crest, a lover's gift, a mere decorative choice by a jeweler she had once patronized? The answers felt tantalizingly close yet impossibly distant, like a word perched on the tip of her tongue. "I'll speak with her," Ethan was saying, his voice lowered but still audible. "Perhaps she can perform some service in exchange for her board until her memory returns." "The town council will expect me to object to such charity," Holloway replied. "These are difficult times, Doctor. The cannery has reduced shifts, the spring hauls have been disappointing, and we pride ourselves on being a community that cares for those in need," Ethan finished firmly. "Or have your political ambitions altered that long-standing value?" Eleanor heard the mayor's indignant sputter, followed by the sound of the clinic door closing with more force than necessary. Moments later, Ethan appeared through the curtain, his expression softening as he observed her obvious distress. "You heard," he stated rather than asked. Eleanor nodded, fingers closing protectively around the locket. "Am I to be sent away then?" Ethan pulled a stool beside her bed and sat, his posture conveying fatigue accumulated over many sleepless nights. "Not if I can help it, but I must be honesty. Our situation presents challenges. The clinic cannot house you indefinitely, and without knowing your background or skills." "I can work," Eleanor insisted, straightening her shoulders despite the lingering ache in her ribs. "I may not remember who I am, but my hands recall how to fold linens. This morning when Meredith was preparing medicinal teas, I knew instinctively which herbs she would reach for next." Ethan's eyebrows rose slightly at this revelation. "You have knowledge of medicinal preparations?" "Apparently," Eleanor replied, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Though I couldn't tell you where I learned such things." The doctor studied her thoughtfully, noting the intelligence in her amber eyes, the way she carried herself, even while seated, a certain poise that spoke of education and refinement. "There may be a solution, though it's not ideal," he finally said. "Meredith has been overburdened since Mrs. Harper left to care for her daughter's new twins in Portland. If you're willing to assist in the clinic, help with patients and preparations, it would justify your continued presence here." Hope kindled in Eleanor's chest. "I would be most grateful for the opportunity." "The compensation would be minimal," Ethan warned. "Room and board in the small chamber above the dispensary, a modest stipend for personal necessities." "Far better than Westham, I should think." Ethan nodded, rising from the stool. "Rest today. Tomorrow, if you feel strong enough, Meredith will begin showing you the routine." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing, the town will talk. Small communities always do. Some, like our mayor, may view you with suspicion. Others will be merely curious. All will have questions you cannot answer." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the locket once more, drawing comfort from its solid presence. "Then I shall focus on creating new memories until the old ones deign to return." By the end of her first week working at the clinic, Eleanor had established herself as an asset rather than a burden. Her hands proved skilled at bandaging wounds, her manner soothing to distressed patients, her mind quick to grasp Ethan's medical instructions. The suspicious glances from townspeople gradually gave way to cautious acceptance, though she remained the woman from the sea in most conversations, her borrowed name used primarily by the Whitmans and a handful of regular patients. On Sunday morning, Eleanor accompanied Meredith to the stone church, wearing a dress the older woman had altered to fit her slighter frame. The whispers followed them down the aisle, but Eleanor kept her gaze forward, spine straight, expression placid despite the inner turmoil of being surrounded by people who shared histories, relationships, and memories, all the things she lacked. As they settled into a pew near the back, Eleanor felt a prickling sensation, as if someone were watching her more intently than the others. She glanced around discreetly and found herself meeting the steady gaze of a man seated across the aisle, tall and broad-shouldered, with features that might have been considered handsome were they not set in such a severe expression. Unlike the other congregants whose curiosity seemed merely casual, this man's attention felt purposeful, almost personal. "Who is that?" Eleanor whispered to Meredith as the first hymn began. Meredith followed her gaze, and her lips tightened slightly. "Alexander Barrett owns most of the shipping operations along this stretch of coast, a powerful man in these parts." She hesitated, then added in an even lower tone, "and not one known for his charitable nature or forgiving temperament." Eleanor nodded her understanding and turned her attention to the hymnal, though she could still feel Barrett's eyes upon her throughout the service. It wasn't merely curiosity in that gaze, there was recognition, or perhaps the expectation of recognition, as if he knew something about her that even she did not. When the service concluded, Eleanor followed Meredith toward the exit, keeping her head lowered to avoid further scrutiny. They had nearly reached the door when a deep voice addressed her directly. "Pardon the intrusion, miss, but I wonder if we might have been previously acquainted." Eleanor turned to find Alexander Barrett standing before her, his considerable height forcing her to tilt her head back to meet his eyes that were studying her with unsettling intensity. "I'm afraid I wouldn't know, sir," she replied evenly, acutely aware of nearby conversations dying away as people strained to eavesdrop. "My memories extend back only as far as my arrival in Oakford. Yes, I've heard the remarkable tale." His tone suggested he found it more suspicious than remarkable. Found on the beach with no identification save a silver locket. Most unusual. Eleanor's hand instinctively moved to her throat, where the locket now hung on a ribbon Meredith had provided. "Do you recognize it, Mr. Barrett? Or perhaps me?" His gaze flickered to the locket, then back to her face. Something unreadable passed across his features, a tightening around the eyes, a subtle shift in his posture. "I make it my business to remember faces, particularly those that appear unexpectedly in my territory. Yours seems not entirely unfamiliar." Before Eleanor could respond, Meredith stepped forward, placing a protective hand on her arm. "Eleanor is still recovering, Mr. Barrett. If you have specific information about her identity, we would welcome it. Otherwise, I'm sure you understand her need for rest." Barrett's expression hardened at the intervention, but he offered a stiff nod. "Of course. My apologies for detaining you." As they moved past him, he added, "Should your memory return, Miss Eleanor, I would be most interested in hearing your complete story." The words followed Eleanor from the church, not a casual remark, but something closer to a command, or perhaps a warning. Outside in the spring sunshine, she drew a deep breath, trying to dispel the unease that clung to her like sea mist. "Does he truly recognize me, do you think?" she asked Meredith as they walked back toward the clinic. Meredith's expression was troubled. "I couldn't say. Alexander Barrett is not a man who shows his cards before he's ready to play them." She squeezed Eleanor's arm reassuringly. "But whatever game he's engaged in, you needn't face it alone. You have friends in Oakford now. Friends but not family. Allies but not a past." As they approached the clinic, Eleanor caught sight of her reflection in the window glass. A woman neither young nor old, neither plain nor beautiful, with amber eyes that held questions even she couldn't answer. Somewhere beyond her reach lay the truth of who she was and how she had come to wash up on Oakford's shore. Until those mysteries resolved, she would remain Eleanor, the woman without memory, defined not by her history, but by the present moment and whatever uncertain future awaited her. Summer arrived in Oakford with a generosity that seemed to compensate for the harsh winter past. Gardens flourished, fishing boats returned with abundant catches, and the townspeople's spirits lifted with the lengthening days. For Eleanor, the 3 months since her mysterious arrival had established a rhythm to her life mornings, assisting Ethan with patients, afternoons preparing remedies and organizing supplies with Meredith, evenings spent in quiet contemplation or gentle conversation as they shared simple meals in the Whitmans' cozy kitchen. Yet beneath this peaceful routine, questions continued to ripple through her consciousness, like stones dropped in still water. Who was she? What circumstances had brought her to Oakford's shores? Why did certain things, the scent of jasmine, the sound of a particular folk melody, the sight of ships departing for distant ports trigger emotional responses that had no coherent memories attached? "The mind protects itself," Ethan had explained one evening, when he found her staring at her reflection, searching for familiarity in her own features. "Some traumas are too great to process all at once. Your memories may return gradually, or they may emerge suddenly when triggered by the right stimulus. Or they may never return at all," Eleanor had responded, voicing the fear that grew stronger with each passing week. Ethan had no reassurance to offer beyond a sympathetic smile and a gentle squeeze of her hand. The truth was, cases like hers were rare in his experience, documented primarily in medical journals rather than his own practice. The longer her amnesia persisted, the more likely it became that her past would remain shrouded in mystery. On market day in late June, Eleanor accompanied Meredith to town, their basket already half filled with herbs they couldn't grow in the clinic's small garden. The weekly market transformed Oakford's central square from a quiet thoroughfare to a bustling hub of commerce and conversation. Farmers displayed produce from inland fields, fishmongers arranged their morning catches on beds of ice, and craftspeople exhibited wares from practical cookware to decorative trinkets. Eleanor had grown accustomed to the curious glances that still followed her through town, though the intensity had diminished as her presence became more familiar. She no longer felt like a spectacle, merely a puzzle that the townspeople had set aside for lack of pieces. "We need ginger root, if Mrs. Peterson's nausea is to improve," Meredith noted, consulting her list as they navigated between stalls. "And perhaps some of that lavender from the Carson farm. The quality is superior to what we've managed to grow." Eleanor nodded, her attention momentarily captured by a display of handcrafted jewelry, Among the copper bangles and wooden beads sat a silver pendant that bore a striking resemblance to her locket, the same wave pattern surrounding a star. Her heart quickened as she approached the stall, hope flaring that she might finally discover a connection to her past. Beautiful piece, isn't it? The jeweler, an elderly man with spectacles perched on his nose, smiled at her interest. Traditional design from up north, represents safe passage for seafarers, the star that guides them home through stormy waters. I have something similar, Eleanor said, drawing the locket from beneath her collar. Do you recognize the craftsmanship? Perhaps know where it might have originated? The old man squinted, examining the locket with professional interest. Fine work, much older than mine. The silver content is higher to see the patina. This wasn't made locally, maybe Newport or even Boston. He handed it back with an apologetic shrug. Sorry I can't be more help. Disappointment settled over Eleanor, like a familiar cloak as she tucked the locket away. Another dead end, another fragment without context. She turned to rejoin Meredith, who had moved ahead to the herb stall when a voice called out across the square. You there, woman? Eleanor turned toward the commotion. A weathered fisherman, hair salt-white and face deeply lined, was pointing at her with undisguised excitement. He broke away from his companions and hurried toward her, moving with surprising agility for one of his apparent years. It is you, he declared, coming to a halt before her. His rheumy eyes examined her face with such intensity that Eleanor took an instinctive step backward. You're the spitting image of her. Can't believe I didn't see it before now. I'm sorry, Eleanor replied cautiously, aware that a small crowd had begun to gather, eager for any new development in the mystery of the woman from the sea. Do you know me? The old man shook his head. Not you, miss, but I knew someone who looked remarkably like you about 20 years back. A passenger on the Meridian Queen bound for Boston from the Caribbean islands. Eleanor's pulse quickened. The Meridian Queen? Was that a ship? Aye, a fine vessel in her day, sank in a fierce nor'easter, winter of '48. I was second mate then, one of just 7 survivors. His gnarled finger pointed to her throat where the locket lay hidden. She wore something like what you got there. Remember thinking it was mighty fancy for a governess. A governess, Eleanor echoed, struggling to process this potential glimpse into her past. Did she survive the shipwreck? The old sailor's expression darkened. No, miss. Few did. Body was never recovered, like most of them. He studied her face again, uncertainty creeping into his features. Course, you're too young to be her. Must be kin somehow, daughter, maybe. The resemblance is uncanny. Meredith had returned to Eleanor's side, her protective presence a silent support as the sailor continued his tale, describing how the Meridian Queen had been caught in one of the worst storms in memory, how the lifeboats had been crushed by massive waves before they could be properly launched, how the survivors had clung to floating debris for hours before rescue arrived. And you're certain about the year? Meredith pressed, her analytical mind seeking concrete facts amid the dramatic narrative. 1848. Certain as sunrise, the old man confirmed. Was laid up for 3 months after, healing from broken ribs and worse. Missed the birth of my youngest because of it, Eleanor calculated quickly. If the woman who resembled her had died in 1848, and if she was indeed a relative, perhaps her mother, then Eleanor herself must be at least in her 20s, possibly older. The timeline seemed plausible, yet something about the story felt wrong, like a garment that didn't quite fit despite appearing the correct size. Did you know her name? She asked, the question emerging as little more than a whisper. The governess? The sailor rubbed his chin, his brow furrowing with the effort of recollection. Charlotte, I believe. Or Caroline. Something with a C. She was traveling with her employer's family, the Darnells or Darlings. Something of that nature. It wasn't much, but it was the first tangible connection to a possible past that Eleanor had encountered since washing ashore. She thanked the old sailor for his information, promising to seek him out if her memory returned, and she could confirm or refute his theory. As the crowd dispersed and they resumed their marketing, Meredith observed the mixture of emotions playing across Eleanor's features. It may be nothing more than coincidence, she cautioned gently. A passing resemblance, a similar locket. I know, Eleanor acknowledged. But it's something, isn't it? A place to begin searching, rather than waiting passively for memories that may never surface. Meredith nodded her understanding. We can send inquiries about the Darnell family, see if there are records of their governess. Perhaps there are surviving family members who might recognize you. The seed of hope that had been planted took root in Eleanor's heart, small but resilient. She completed their shopping with renewed energy, imagining for the first time a concrete path that might lead back to her identity. If the sailor was correct, if she was somehow connected to this long-ago governess who had perished at sea, then perhaps records existed, letters, photographs, employment documents that could illuminate who she was and where she belonged. Yet, as they walked back to the clinic, basket heavy with their purchases, Eleanor couldn't shake a persistent unease. If she was related to a woman who had died more than 2 decades ago, how had she herself come to be adrift at sea? What circumstances had placed her, unconscious and alone, at the mercy of the same ocean that had claimed her possible relative? And why, when she tried to picture the Meridian Queen, did she envision not a wooden sailing vessel of the 1840s, but something larger, metal, moderner ship from a much more recent era? Alexander Barrett's connection to Eleanor's mystery deepened unexpectedly on a fog-shrouded Tuesday in early July. She had been sent to deliver medicine to the lighthouse keeper, whose rheumatism worsened with the damp weather that had settled over Oakford like a persistent visitor. The lighthouse stood on a rocky promontory at the northern edge of the bay, connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway that disappeared at high tide. Eleanor welcomed the errand despite the dreary conditions. The journey provided rare solitude, a chance to reflect without the well-intentioned but constant presence of the Whitmans. The mist transformed familiar landmarks into hazy apparitions, creating an otherworldly landscape that matched her internal state, a woman walking through a half-visible reality, never quite certain of her footing. She had nearly reached the causeway when the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats emerged from the fog behind her. Eleanor stepped to the side of the narrow road, expecting to see one of the local farmers returning from an early delivery. Instead, Alexander Barrett appeared astride a magnificent black stallion, his tall figure somehow more imposing on horseback than it had been in the church. "Miss Eleanor," he greeted her, reining his horse to a stop. "A rather dismal day for a solitary walk." "I have medicine for Mr. Harris," she explained, lifting the small package she carried. "His joints trouble him in weather like this." Barrett studied her through the swirling mist, his expression unreadable. "The causeway will be under water within the hour. Allow me to accompany you. I have business with Harris myself." Before Eleanor could formulate a polite refusal, Barrett had dismounted and was leading his horse alongside her. The situation left little choice but to accept his escort, though his presence made her uneasy for reasons she couldn't articulate. "You've become quite established in Oakford," he observed as they walked. "The Whitmans speak highly of your contributions to their practice." "They've been extraordinarily kind," Eleanor replied, surprised that the reclusive businessman had been discussing her with anyone. "I'm fortunate they offered me a position." "Indeed." Something in Barrett's tone suggested he considered her more fortunate than deserving. "Tell me, has your memory shown any signs of returning? Any flashes of your former life?" Eleanor hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal about the sailor's story. "Nothing substantial. Occasional impressions, sensations that seem familiar without context." They had reached the causeway, where the fog hung so heavily that the lighthouse was visible only as a periodic gleam when its lamp rotated toward shore. The rough stone path was already partly submerged, waves lapping at its edges with increasing confidence as the tide rose. "We should hurry," Barrett advised, securing his horse to a post on the mainland side. "The sea grows impatient." They traversed the causeway in silence, Eleanor intensely aware of Barrett's proximity as the path narrowed. When they reached the small island, the lighthouse keeper was already waiting at his door, having spotted their approach through his telescope. "Didn't expect a parade today," Harris remarked dryly, his weathered face creasing with a smile for Eleanor. "Come in before the fog seeps into your bones." The lighthouse keeper's quarters were modest, but meticulously maintained, every surface gleaming with polish, every item secured against the constant motion of living at the edge of the sea. Eleanor delivered the medication along with Ethan's instructions, while Barrett engaged Harris in a conversation about recent shipping schedules that clearly constituted his business. As the men talked, Eleanor found herself drawn to the sitting room's small window, which offered a view of the lighthouse itself, connected to the cottage by a covered walkway. Something about its stark white tower against the grey backdrop stirred an uncomfortable sensation in her chest, not quite memory, but a shadow of recognition that made her heart race. "Would you like to see inside?" Harris's voice interrupted her thoughts. Most visitors find it intriguing. Before she could respond, Barrett interjected, Miss Eleanor was just about to tell us more about her progress in recovering her memory. His gaze fixed on her with that same unsettling intensity she had noticed in church, particularly any recollections about her arrival in Oakford Waters. Harris's eyebrows rose at the barely concealed accusation in Barrett's tone. The lady doesn't owe us any explanations, Mr. Barrett. She's been through an ordeal none of us can imagine. On the contrary, Barrett replied smoothly, when a stranger appears in a small community like ours, with no verifiable history and no clear explanation, everyone deserves answers for safety if nothing else. Eleanor straightened her spine, meeting Barrett's challenging gaze directly. I would be delighted to see the lighthouse, Mr. Harris, she said, deliberately ignoring Barrett's comment. I've admired it from a distance since my arrival. The keeper led them through the covered walkway and into the tower's base, explaining its construction and function with the pride of a man who had dedicated his life to its operation. Eleanor listened attentively, though she couldn't shake the feeling that Barrett was watching her reactions rather than paying attention to Harris's explanations. As they ascended the spiral staircase toward the lamp room, Eleanor's discomfort intensified. The circular chamber, with its massive Fresnel lens at the center and windows offering a panoramic view of the fog-obscured sea, triggered a visceral response. Her palms began to sweat. Her breathing grew shallow and a hollow feeling opened in the pit of her stomach. Are you unwell, Miss Eleanor? Harris asked, noticing her distress. Just a momentary dizziness, she assured him, though in truth it was something far more disturbing, a certainty that she had stood in a place very like this before, under circumstances that her mind refused to resurrect fully. Barrett moved closer, his voice lowered for her ears alone. You recognize this place, don't you? Or one similar to it? It wasn't a question but a statement of fact, delivered with such confidence that Eleanor found herself nodding before she could consider the implications. Yes, but its fragmented impressions without context. Something close to satisfaction flickered across Barrett's features. I thought as much. The sea brings back only what it chooses, when it chooses. Before Eleanor could question this cryptic remark, a tremendous crash of thunder shook the lighthouse, startling all three occupants. The storm that had been gathering strength offshore had arrived with unexpected ferocity, battering the tower with wind and rain that reduced visibility to nearly nothing. We've lost our window, Harris announced grimly, peering through the streaming glass. The causeway will be completely submerged now. I'm afraid you're both stranded until morning. The prospect of spending the night in the lighthouse keeper's quarters, in such close proximity to Alexander Barrett, filled Eleanor with unease. Yet, as another thunderclap rattled the windows and lightning illuminated the raging sea below, she realized there was truly no alternative. I'll prepare rooms, Harris said, already moving toward the stairs. It'll be cramped but dry, which is more than you'd have trying to return to town. As they followed him down the spiral staircase, Barrett placed a hand on Eleanor's arm, halting her progress. In the dim light, his features appeared almost predatory as he leaned closer. Before this night ends, he murmured, we will have a proper conversation about who you really are and why I believe you've come to Oakford for purposes beyond seeking shelter and employment. The accusation hung between them, indistinct yet menacing, like the shadows that played across the lighthouse walls as lightning continued to flash across the turbulent sky. The storm raged through the night, its fury punctuated by thunderclaps that seemed to shake the very foundation of the lighthouse. Eleanor lay awake in the small guest chamber Harris had prepared, listening to the wind howl around the tower like a living creature. Sleep eluded her, kept at bay by the storm's violence and the unsettling conversation with Alexander Barrett that had preceded their retirement for the evening. In the keeper's modest sitting room, with Harris busying himself in the kitchen, Barrett had finally revealed the source of his suspicious interest in her. 5 years ago, he had explained, his voice measured as he warmed his hands by the fire, a vessel under my ownership was lost in circumstances not dissimilar to those that presumably brought you to our shores. The Aurora Borealisa merchant ship returning from the Indies with a cargo of considerable value. Eleanor had remained silent, uncertain where this disclosure was leading, but sensing its importance to the man's fixation on her identity. Among the items lost was a collection of silver jewelry crafted by an artisan in Newport pieces, commissioned by my late wife before her passing. Each bore a distinctive design. Barrett's gaze had shifted meaningfully to the locket at Eleanor's throat. waves surrounding a star, the symbol of safe passage, as mariners would have it. "You believe my locket came from your shipment," Eleanor had stated, understanding dawning. "That I somehow obtained it from the wreckage." Barrett's expression had hardened. "What I believe, Miss Eleanor, is that coincidences of this magnitude are rare in my experience. A woman with no memory appears wearing a distinctive piece that matches items lost from my ship. The timing, the circumstances, they invite questions." Now, as another flash of lightning momentarily transformed her Spartan chamber into stark relief, Eleanor touched the locket that lay against her skin beneath her nightdress. Could Barrett be correct? Had she somehow salvaged this single item from a shipwreck, only to later become a victim of the sea herself? The possibility seemed both plausible and absurd, a narrative that explained the locket, but nothing about her amnesia or how she had come to wash ashore at Oakford. As the storm began to subside near dawn, Eleanor finally drifted into a troubled sleep, filled with disjointed images. A dimly lit cabin rocking with the motion of the sea, Hansha hands frantically searching through drawers, the glint of silver in lamplight, and most disturbingly, a man's face contorted with rage lunging toward her. She woke with a gasp, sweat damp and trembling, uncertain whether she had experienced a genuine memory or merely a nightmare born from Barrett's insinuations. Breakfast was a tense affair. Harris, sensing the undercurrents between his guests, maintained a steady stream of conversation about lighthouse operations and weather predictions. Barrett responded with polite disinterest, his attention clearly focused on Eleanor, who concentrated on her food and contributed little beyond necessary pleasantries. When it was time to depart, the causeway having reappeared with the receding tide, Eleanor felt a profound relief that surprised her with its intensity. Something about the lighthouse, or perhaps Barrett's presence within it, had triggered emotional responses she was unprepared to confront. "I'll escort you back to town," Barrett announced as they stood on the rocky path, no longer a request but a declaration. "That won't be necessary," Eleanor replied firmly. "The path is clear, and Dr. Whitman will be concerned if I don't return soon." Barrett's jaw tightened at her refusal. "The matter of the locket remains unresolved." "There is nothing to resolve, Mr. Barrett. I don't remember how this came into my possession. If it belongs to you, I will gladly return it, though it represents my only link to whoever I was before Oakford." "Keep it," he said after a moment's consideration. "For now. But our conversation isn't finished, Miss Eleanor. Sooner or later, the sea gives up its secrets, as will you." He mounted his horse without further comment, urging the animal into a canter that quickly carried him toward town, leaving Eleanor to make her way back on foot. She was grateful for the solitude, using the walk to process the fragments of dream memory that had emerged during the night. By the time she reached the clinic, where a worried Meredith greeted her with obvious relief, Eleanor had resolved to learn more about Barrett's lost ship and the circumstances of its sinking. Over the following days, discreet inquiries around town yielded scattered information about the Aurora Borealis. The vessel had indeed been lost at sea 5 years earlier, though accounts of the cause varied. Some blamed a sudden storm, others mechanical failure, and a few hinted at more sinister possibilities, including sabotage by Barrett's business rivals. "He took it hard," the harbourmaster's wife confided when Eleanor stopped by their cottage on the pretext of delivering a tonic for the woman's chronic cough. Not just the financial loss, mind you, though that was substantial. It was the personal connection. His wife had been dead less than a year, and those jewelry pieces were among the last things she commissioned before her illness took hold. "Did they recover anything from the wreck?" Eleanor asked, attempting to keep her tone casual. "Not to my knowledge. The ship went down in deep waters, well off the usual shipping lanes. They found some debris, enough to confirm the vessel was lost, but no significant cargo." The woman leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Though there are those who say Barrett became obsessed with recovering what was lost. Has a collection of items salvaged from other wreck scores it his memorial to the sea's acquisitions." This new information presented Barrett in a different light, not merely a suspicious businessman protecting his interests, but a grieving widower fixated on recovering connections to his late wife. It didn't excuse his intimidating behavior toward Eleanor, but it provided context that made his actions more comprehensible. 3 days after the lighthouse incident, a messenger arrived at the clinic bearing an envelope addressed to Eleanor. Inside was a formal invitation to dine at Barrett Manor the following evening. The phrasing made it clear this was less a social invitation than a summoning. with a postscript noting that transportation would be provided given the estate's distance from town. "You don't have to accept," Meredith said when Eleanor showed her the invitation. "The man has no authority over you, regardless of his position in Oakford. Yet he clearly believes he has information relevant to my past," Eleanor replied, refolding the heavy paper. "If there's any chance of learning more about myself or the locket, I should take it." Ethan was less supportive when consulted. Barrett's reputation for fairness is questionable at best. He's been known to manipulate situations to his advantage without regard for those affected. "All the more reason I should meet him on terms where I'm prepared," Eleanor argued. "Otherwise, he may continue to appear unexpectedly, making accusations when I'm vulnerable." Unable to dissuade her, the Whitmans instead helped Eleanor prepare for the encounter. Meredith altered one of her better dresses to fit Eleanor's frame, creating an ensemble that, while modest, conveyed dignity and self-possession. Ethan provided what information he had about Barrett Manor and its owner's habits, having treated various staff members over the years. "He lives alone save for his household staff," Ethan explained as they sat in the clinic kitchen the night before the dinner. "No children from his marriage, no close family that anyone knows of. Since his wife's death, he's become increasingly reclusive, focused almost exclusively on his business interests. And collecting items from shipwrecks, apparently," Eleanor added, recalling the harbourmaster's wife's comment. Ethan nodded. "A peculiar hobby, though perhaps understandable given his loss. Just be cautious, Eleanor. Barrett is used to imposing his will on others. Don't allow yourself to be intimidated or manipulated." When the carriage arrived the following evening, Eleanor was outwardly composed despite her internal anxiety. The vehicle itself, an elegant conveyance with polished brass fittings and the Barrett shipping logo emblazoned on its doorspoke of wealth, beyond what was typically displayed in modest Oakford. As they departed the town limits, Eleanor watched familiar landscapes give way to less traveled roads, winding through coastal forests. After nearly an hour's journey, they crested a hill, and Barrett Manor appeared below, a sprawling stone mansion overlooking the sea from atop a cliff, its windows gleaming in the setting sun like watchful eyes. The driver, who had maintained a professional silence throughout the journey, finally spoke as they approached the imposing entrance. "Mr. Barrett requested that you be informed this was originally a customs house, built in colonial times to monitor shipping. He had it expanded and renovated after purchasing it 15 years ago." The information seemed oddly specific, and Eleanor wondered if it held some significance beyond architectural history. As the carriage came to a halt, and a liveried servant approached to assist her descent, she squared her shoulders and prepared to enter the domain of the man who seemed convinced their fates were somehow intertwined, the collector of broken things, lost and returned by the relentless sea. Barrett Manor's interior matched its imposing exterior, a monument to calculated opulence rather than comfort. Eleanor was led through a high-ceilinged entrance hall, adorned with maritime paintings and model ships displayed in glass cases, each meticulously labeled with the vessel's name and fate. The macabre exhibition continued into a formal drawing room, where the walls featured salvaged ship nameplates and framed nautical charts, marking the locations of famous wrecks. "Mr. Barrett will join you momentarily," the butler informed her, gesturing toward a velvet-upholstered chair positioned near the fireplace. "May I offer refreshment while you wait?" Eleanor declined politely, preferring to maintain complete clarity for the encounter ahead. Left alone, she examined the room more closely, noting the obsessive attention to cataloguing and preserving maritime disasters. Each artifact was accompanied by a small card detailing its origins, the name of the vessel, the date of its demise, the circumstances of the item's recovery. Barrett's collection was not merely extensive, it was meticulously documented with a historian's precision. One display case particularly drew her attention, a glass-fronted cabinet containing what appeared to be personal effects recovered from various wrecks. Pocket watches frozen at the moment their owners had met disaster, tarnished wedding rings, combs, spectacles, even a child's small wooden toy horse. Each item represented not just a shipwreck, but an individual life interrupted, possibly ended, by the sea's implacable force. "Mementos mori," Barrett's voice announced from the doorway. Reminders of mortality and of the sea's indifference to human aspirations. Eleanor turned to find her host watching her with that now familiar intensity, dressed in formal evening attire that emphasized his commanding presence. Some might consider it morbid, she observed, gesturing toward the display. This collection of tragedy. I prefer to think of it as respectful remembrance, Barrett countered, crossing the room to stand beside her. Each item represents a story that might otherwise be forgotten. The sea takes so much. I merely preserve what little returns to shore. Before Eleanor could respond, the butler reappeared to announce dinner was served. Barrett offered his arm with practiced courtesy, leading her through a corridor lined with more maritime artifacts, into a dining room dominated by a massive table that could have seated 20. Only 2 places were set, at opposite ends of the polished mahogany expanse. I thought perhaps a more intimate arrangement would facilitate our conversation, Barrett explained, redirecting her to a smaller adjoining room where a round table for 4 had been prepared by a window overlooking the darkening sea. Candles provided most of the illumination, their flames reflecting in the glass like distant lighthouses. The meal began with a formal civility that belied the tension between them. Barrett proved an educated conversationalist, discussing literature, music, and art, with the ease of someone accustomed to moving in refined circles. Eleanor matched his discourse, surprising herself with knowledge she didn't realize she possessed opinions on composers whose names seemed familiar, though she couldn't recall ever hearing their works, observations about books she couldn't remember reading. You're clearly a woman of education and culture, Barrett noted, as the main course was served by silent staff who appeared and disappeared with practiced efficiency. Your manners, your speech patterns, your knowledge of subjects typically reserved for the privileged classes, these aren't traits one acquires in common circumstances. So I've been discovering, Eleanor acknowledged. For though without context, these fragments of knowledge are like pieces from different puzzles. I can't assemble them into a coherent picture of who I was. Barrett studied her across the candle-lit table. Perhaps I can provide some context, Miss Eleanor. Or should I address you differently? Eleanor set down her fork, her appetite suddenly diminished. If you know my true name, Mr. Barrett, I would be grateful to hear it. I have suspicions rather than certainties, he replied, taking a sip of wine. When you appeared in Oakford, wearing a locket that matches items lost with the Aurora Borealis, it seemed too convenient to be coincidence. Yet you present as genuinely amnesiac rather than deliberately deceptive. I assure you, my condition is not a performance. I believe you. Barrett's admission surprised her. Which leads me to a theory I've been developing since our encounter at the lighthouse. You recognize that environment? I saw it in your reaction. Yet you have no conscious memory of why. Eleanor nodded cautiously. There was a familiarity, and later, dreams that felt like fragmented memories, though I can't determine if they're genuine recollections or fabrications influenced by our conversation. Barrett leaned forward, his dinner forgotten. Describe these dream memories. She hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal to this man who remained essentially a stranger, despite his apparent connection to her past. Yet if he truly possessed information that might illuminate her identity, cooperation seemed her only viable path forward. A cabin on a ship, she began, keeping her voice steady despite the emotional response the images still evoked. Myself, searching through some kind of furniture, a dresser or desk, finding something silver, presumably this locket, and she paused, reluctant to share the final disturbing image. And, Barrett prompted, a man's face, contorted with anger, moving toward me aggressively. She touched the locket unconsciously. That's where the fragment ends. A complex array of emotions crossed Barrett's features, surprise, calculation, something that might have been vindication. The timing is consistent, he murmured, almost to himself. And the physical resemblance. Mr. Barrett, Eleanor said firmly, patience wearing thin. If you have information about my identity, I ask you directly to share it, rather than speaking in riddles. He seemed to come to a decision, rising from his chair. Follow me. There's something you should see. Barrett led her from the dining room, through corridors decorated with more maritime memorabilia, until they reached a door that he unlocked with a key from his pocket. Inside was a private study, its walls lined with bookshelves and filing cabinets rather than shipwreck artifacts. He moved to a large desk and withdrew a folder from a drawer, removing several documents and a daguerreotype that he handed to Eleanor. The Aurora Borealis carried 6 passengers in addition to its cargo and crew, he explained, as she examined the photographic image of a stern-faced woman in her 30s, dressed in the fashion of 5 or 6 years prior. Among them was my wife's cousin, Marianne Caldwell, traveling home after settling affairs at her late mother's plantation in the Indies. Eleanor studied the image, searching for any sense of recognition or connection. The woman bore a passing resemblance to her own features, similar chin and brow structure, but not enough to suggest they were the same person. "I'm not this woman," she stated with certainty, "though I suppose we might be related." "No, you're not Marianne," Barrett agreed, retrieving the photograph and replacing it with a ship's manifest. "But notice the entry here, Caldwell, accompanied by lady's maid, C. Ellsworth." Eleanor's fingers traced the name on the document, a strange tingling sensation spreading through her chest. "Charlotte Ellsworth," she whispered, the name feeling simultaneously foreign and familiar on her tongue. "Charlotte Ellsworth," Barrett repeated, watching her reaction closely. 27 years of age at the time of the Aurora's sinking. No family connections noted in the company's records. Employed by Marianne Caldwell for approximately 3 years prior to the voyage. "You believe I am this Charlotte?" Eleanor asked, struggling to connect the name with her sense of self. "The physical description matches what little was recorded about her. The timing of your appearance, the locket which was indeed part of the collection my wife commissioned, though intended as a gift for Marianne rather than personal jewelry." Eleanor sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed by information that should have brought clarity, but instead created new questions. If the ship sank 5 years ago, where have I been all this time? Why would my memories suddenly vanish now? And how did I come to wash ashore in Oakford, rather than perishing with the others? Barrett returned the documents to their folder before responding. Those questions remain unanswered. No survivors from the Aurora were ever confirmed. The wreckage suggested a catastrophic failure, possibly an explosion in the cargo hold, though the investigation was inconclusive. "Yet you believe I somehow survived," Eleanor pressed, only to reappear 5 years later with no memory of the intervening time. "Stranger things have happened at sea," Barrett replied, his expression unreadable in the study's shadowed light. "The question that concerns me more immediately is what you were doing in Marianne Caldwell's cabin, searching through her belongings, when disaster struck." "You're suggesting I was stealing from my employer," Eleanor said, rising from the chair with indignation. "Based on a fragmentary dream memory that may not even be accurate." Barrett's expression remained impassive. "I suggest nothing. I merely observe that your own recollection places you in a situation that invites questions." "Questions based on assumptions," Eleanor countered. "Perhaps I was packing her belongings, or she had asked me to retrieve something. Without context, that single image proves nothing about my character or actions." A tense silence filled the study as they regarded each other across the divide of accusation and defense. Finally, Barrett spoke, his tone moderated. "You're right, of course. It would be unjust to draw conclusions from such limited information." His concession surprised Eleanor, though she remained wary of his ultimate intentions. "If I am indeed Charlotte Ellsworth, what do you want from me, Mr. Barrett?" Initially, answers about the Aurora's final hours information that might explain why a ship with an experienced captain and crew sailing in fair weather met with catastrophe. Barrett moved to a cabinet and withdrew a decanter and 2 glasses. "Now that I've met you, observed your genuine confusion, I'm less certain." He poured amber liquid into both glasses, offering one to Eleanor, who declined with a slight shake of her head. "The collector in me wants to catalogue you among my artifacts. The miraculous survivor returned from the deep. The businessman wants closure on a significant loss, and the human being." He paused, considering the amber liquid in his glass. "So the human being recognizes another soul, marked by the sea's capricious nature." The admission contained a vulnerability at odds with Barrett's usual commanding presence. For the first time, Eleanor glimpsed the grief behind his obsessive collection, each artifact a surrogate, for what he truly wished to recover but could not. His wife, his sense of security, his belief in a world where loss could be managed and controlled. "I don't know if I can provide the answers you seek," Eleanor said honestly, "but I want to understand who I was, who I am, as much as you want your questions resolved." Barrett nodded, reaching a decision. "Then perhaps we should approach this as allies rather than adversaries. I have resources that might help recover your memory specialists in Boston who have had success with cases similar to yours." The offer was tempting, but Eleanor's instincts counseled caution. Barrett's apparent shift from suspicious interrogator to potential benefactor seemed too abrupt to trust completely. "I appreciate the offer," she replied carefully, "but I've established a life in Oakford. Modest though it may be, the Whitmans have been kind and my work at the clinic is fulfilling. As a doctor's assistant? Barrett's tone conveyed skepticism. If you are Charlotte Ellsworth, you were educated, literate, capable of much more than bandaging fishermen's wounds and mixing tonics. The condescension stung. There's dignity in helping others, Mr. Barrett, regardless of their station. Not all value is measured in commercial terms or social prestige. Her rebuke landed with visible effect. Barrett inclined his head in acknowledgement. Again, you're right. Please forgive my presumption. He set down his untouched drink. At least allow me to provide you with copies of the Aurora's passenger and crew manifests. They may trigger memories that could aid your recovery. Thank you, Eleanor accepted, recognizing the gesture as a tentative truce. I would also be grateful for any information about Charlotte Ellsworth's background, where she came from, if she had family. I'll have my secretary compile what records we have, Barrett promised. Though I must warn you, employees like ladies' maids often left minimal traces in official documents. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the study door. The butler entered, his usually impassive face betraying concern. Forgive the intrusion, sir, but Mr. Harris from the lighthouse has arrived. He insists on speaking with you and the lady immediately on a matter of grave importance. Barrett's eyebrows rose in surprise. Harris left his post? It must be significant indeed. Show him in. The lighthouse keeper entered moments later, still wearing his uniform coat, his weathered face flushed from exertion. Pardon the intrusion, Mr. Barrett. Miss Eleanor. He nodded to each in turn, removing his cap. But I've discovered something that couldn't wait until morning. Please sit, Barrett offered, gesturing to a chair. What's so urgent that you'd abandon your post? I'm between shifts. Jenkins is minding the light, Harris explained, remaining standing. It's about the lady here. After your visit, something about her reaction to the lighthouse kept nagging at me. I've seen that look before, the disorientation, the half-recognition. Eleanor leaned forward, pulse quickening. You have? Harris nodded. My predecessor, old Caleb Morris, kept journals of his service. Detailed records of ships passing, weather conditions, maintenance performed. I've been reading through them recently, organizing the archives. He removed a small, leather-bound book from his coat pocket. This entry is from 5 years ago, the night the Aurora Borealis was lost. Barrett practically snatched the journal, opening it to where Harris had marked a page. His eyes widened as he read, then wordlessly passed the book to Eleanor. Written in a spidery hand, the entry described a violent storm that had blown up suddenly on what had been a clear night. Morris had recorded watching a ship later identified as the Aurora Borealis struggling in the mounting waves. Then came the passage that caused Eleanor's hands to tremble. 3:40 a.m. observed explosion amidships. Vessel breaking apart rapidly. No lifeboats successfully launched. Debris and bodies visible in lamp sweep. One survivor spotted clinging to floating cabin door, female, pulled from water at great risk by Jenkins and self. Unconscious, severe head injury, no identification. Transported to mainland medical care at first light. Young woman, dark hair, wearing nightdress and silver locket. Eleanor looked up from the journal, her vision blurring with emotions she couldn't name. I survived the sinking, she whispered. And were rescued by the lighthouse keepers, Barrett added, his expression transformed by this revelation. But according to town records, no survivor was ever reported. Harris shifted uncomfortably. That's the strange part. Morris's entries stop after that night. Jenkins transferred to the northern station a week later. When I took the position 3 years ago, there was no mention of any rescue. He hesitated, then continued. But while cleaning last week, I found this hidden beneath a floorboard in Morris's old room. He produced a folded paper from his pocket, yellowed with age. Inside was a newspaper clipping about the Aurora disaster, with "She lived" scrawled in the margin, in the same handwriting as the journal. Alongside it was a small pencil sketch of a woman who unmistakably resembled Eleanor. Morris was an artist of sorts, Harris explained. Drew what he saw to supplement his written records. But why hide the information? Eleanor asked, struggling to process these fragments of her past. Why not report the rescue? Perhaps he did, Barrett suggested, his analytical mind engaging with the mystery. But consider the timing. My shipping company was embroiled in litigation over the disaster. Insurance claims, accusations of negligence, investigations into the cause. A survivor might have been seen as a valuable witness by multiple parties with conflicting interests. Or a liability, Eleanor added softly, the implications becoming clear. Someone who might reveal inconvenient truths about what actually happened that night. Harris nodded gravely. Morris died suddenly 3 months after the Aurora sinking. Heart failure, according to the doctor's report. But he was only 52 with no history of heart problems. The three sat in stunned silence as the pieces aligned into a disturbing pattern. Someone had gone to considerable lengths to conceal Eleanor's survival, perhaps the same someone responsible for the Aurora's destruction. But who? And why? And most perplexingly, where had she been during the 5 years between the disaster and her reappearance on Oakford's shore? "There's one more thing," Harris said, breaking the silence. "When cleaning the lighthouse after the recent storm, I found this wedged behind a storage cabinet." He reached into his pocket one final time and produced a small brass key with an unusual trefoil design on its head. "It's not from any lock in the lighthouse, but when I saw your locket, Miss Eleanor, I noticed the designs were similar." Eleanor examined the key, its weight familiar in her palm. Without thinking, she reached for her locket, comparing the engraved patterns. Not just similar, identical. The star and wave motif appeared on both, clearly crafted by the same hand. "It opens the locket," she realized suddenly. "The clasp is damaged, but this might fit a hidden keyhole." With trembling fingers, she examined the locket's edge, finding a tiny aperture nearly invisible to casual inspection. When she inserted the key, it turned with a soft click, and the locket opened to reveal its long-concealed contents. Inside the locket lay not the expected portrait, but a tightly folded scrap of paper. Eleanor carefully extracted and unfolded it, revealing a message written in a feminine hand. "If you are reading this, I am likely dead. The manifest lists false cargo. Barrett suspects but lacks proof. Evidence in captain's safe. Trust no one from the company. MC Marianne Caldwell, Barrett's wife's cousin and Eleanor's employer, aboard the Aurora." The message's cryptic brevity raised more questions than it answered, yet its implications were undeniable. The ship's sinking had not been an accident, and somehow Marianne had anticipated danger before disaster struck. Eleanor handed the note to Barrett, whose face drained of color as he read the damning message. "False cargo," he murmured. "I ordered a standard shipment of textiles, spices, and plantation goods." His gaze locked with Eleanor's. "If Marianne believed the manifest was falsified, it suggests someone within my company was using the Aurora for unauthorized transport." "Smuggling," Harris supplied bluntly. "It happened often in these waters during the embargo years. Less common now, but still profitable if you're moving the right goods." Barrett's expression hardened as the betrayal registered. "My shipping manager during that period was Vincent Holloway, Mayor Holloway's brother. He had complete authority over cargo verification and manifest preparation." His hands clenched into fists. "Vincent left the company abruptly 4 years ago, claiming a desire to pursue opportunities in the West. I never questioned it." "The mayor knew I survived," Eleanor realized, the pieces suddenly aligning. "His insistence that I be sent to Westham after 3 days, he feared I might remember. And his brother likely knew as well," Barrett added. "Which raises the question of where you've been for 5 years, and why you reappeared now." The answer came to Eleanor in a flash of clarity, not as a recovered memory, but as the logical conclusion to their accumulated evidence. "I never left Oakford," she stated with growing certainty. "Morris and Jenkins rescued me, but someone intercepted their report, someone with authority in town affairs." "The mayor," Harris confirmed. "All official communications passed through his office before reaching the county." "I must have been kept somewhere," Eleanor continued, following the trail of deduction. "Physically recovered from my injuries, but still without memory due to the head trauma. Perhaps initially under legitimate medical care, but then—" "The old Holloway estate," Barrett interjected. "It's been shuttered for years, supposedly undergoing renovations. Isolated, well-staffed with people loyal to the family. The perfect place to keep someone comfortably confined." Harris looked troubled. "But why not simply eliminate the witness? Why maintain her for years?" "Insurance," Eleanor suggested, the word emerging from some intuitive part of her mind. "I might have known something valuable: account details, business connections, information they couldn't access if I were dead." Barrett nodded grimly. "And when you proved unable or unwilling to provide what they wanted, they eventually decided to dispose of you. But something went wrong with their plan." "I escaped," Eleanor whispered, fragments of that night suddenly crystallizing in her consciousness. There was a storm like the night of the Aurora disaster. I took advantage of the confusion to flee. They pursued me to the shoreline. Her voice faltered as partial memories surged forward. Running through rain-lashed darkness, the roar of waves, a desperate plunge into icy water, preferring the sea's mercy to her captor's intentions. And the current carried you to where the fisherman found you, Barrett finished. The sea returned what had been taken twice. Harris rose abruptly. The mayor must be informed that we know. Not yet, Barrett cautioned. The Holloways have significant influence in these parts. We need evidence beyond this note, and our speculations evidence that would stand in court. The captain's safe, Eleanor said, indicating the message. Marianne mentioned evidence there. The safe went down with the ship, Barrett replied, and the wreck has never been precisely located. A heavy silence descended as they contemplated the apparent dead end. Then Harris cleared his throat. Actually, sir, that may not be entirely accurate. Morris's journals include coordinates of where the Aurora sank, recorded as part of his rescue account. With modern diving equipment, the implications hung in the air, tantalizing yet fraught with practical challenges. Barrett's face reflected rapid calculations before he spoke. I have connections with a salvage operation out of Boston. Discreet professionals with experience recovering items from considerable depths. He turned to Eleanor. But we would need someone who might recognize the safe, remember its appearance or location within the captain's quarters. I would accompany such an expedition, Eleanor stated without hesitation. If seeing the lighthouse triggered partial memories, perhaps the wreck itself would restore more. The decision crystallized their tentative alliance into a concrete plan. Barrett would arrange the salvage expedition under the guise of finally recovering personal items from his wife's cousin. Harris would continue searching the lighthouse for additional evidence Morris might have concealed. Eleanor would remain at the clinic, maintaining her routine while discreetly investigating the Holloway estate from a safe distance. 2 weeks later, their efforts converged with dramatic results. The salvage team not only located the Aurora's remains, but successfully recovered the captain's safe, its contents preserved in the airless environment of the sealed compartment. Inside were damning documents, secret correspondence between Vincent Holloway and foreign agents, arranging the transport of prohibited technologies, forged manifests concealing the true nature of certain cargo, and most significantly, evidence of sabotage planned to eliminate witnesses once the illicit operation faced scrutiny. Armed with this evidence, Barrett bypassed the local authorities and traveled directly to the federal marshal's office in Boston. The subsequent investigation moved with surprising speed, resulting in Vincent Holloway's arrest at his Western residence and the mayor's swift resignation and flight from Oakford, an implicit admission of complicity that spared him immediate arrest, but marked him as a fugitive from justice. For Eleanor, legal vindication was accompanied by gradual memory restoration. Working with a specialist physician from Boston, who frequently consulted on amnesia cases, she recovered approximately 60% of her pre-Aurora life. Her childhood in a modest but respectable Philadelphia family, her education at a progressive women's academy, her employment as companion and later lady's maid to Marianne Caldwell after her parents' deaths left her without financial support. Most significantly, she remembered her growing suspicions about Vincent Holloway's activities in the weeks before the Aurora's final voyage. Marianne had shared these concerns, having overheard damning conversations between Vincent and the captain. Her written warning, entrusted to Charlotte with instructions to conceal it in the locket for safekeeping, had been intended as insurance against their increasing certainty that the voyage had been compromised. The explosion that destroyed the Aurora had likely been planned to eliminate everyone with knowledge of the smuggling operation. Charlotte's survival had been an unforeseen complication, necessitating her years of captivity while the Holloways determined what she knew and whether she retained evidence that could implicate them. 6 months after the lighthouse revelation, Eleanor, comfortably reclaiming her birth name of Charlotte, stood on the promontory overlooking Oakford Bay, watching autumn sunlight dance across the water. The town below had weathered its scandal and begun healing with new leadership committed to transparency and honest governance. The Whitman Clinic continued serving the community, though Charlotte's role had evolved from assistant to partner as she pursued formal medical training with Ethan's enthusiastic support. Barrett approached along the clifftop path, his tall figure less imposing now that they had developed a relationship, based on mutual respect rather than suspicion. His shipping company had emerged stronger after purging all connections to the Holloway's operations, with Barrett himself transformed by the experienceless, isolated, more engaged with the community he had previously held at arm's length. "The memorial is in place," he announced as he reached her side, a simple marker near where the Aurora went down, acknowledging all those lost. "Marianne's name is given special prominence, as is fitting for someone who tried to expose the corruption that ultimately claimed her life." Charlotte nodded, grateful for this gesture of respect toward her former employer and friend. She deserved better than history branded her not merely a wealthy woman traveling home, but someone with the courage to stand against wrongdoing, even at great personal risk. "As did you," Barrett observed quietly. "Few would have persevered through what you endured." Charlotte smiled, touching the locket that still hung around her neck, a symbol not of mystery but of truth recovered and justice served. "The sea gives and takes according to its own unfathomable purposes. I'm simply grateful it gave me a second chance and a community worth fighting to protect." They stood in companionable silence, watching fishing boats return to harbor with the day's catch. Oakford had always existed in partnership with the ocean, accepting its dangers alongside its bounties. Charlotte now understood that she shared that relationship marked by the sea's power, but not defined or diminished by its trials. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Charlotte turned from the view, ready to return to the life she had built from fragments of the old and foundations of the new. Her memory might never be completely restored, but she had reclaimed enough of her past to move forward with confidence. The woman who had washed ashore without identity had not merely recovered her name, she had discovered her capacity for resilience, her talent for healing, and her place within a community that had become home in the truest sense. "Shall we head back?" Barrett asked, offering his arm with the easy courtesy that had replaced his former rigidity. Charlotte nodded, taking one last look at the vast expanse of ocean stretching to the horizon, no longer an enigma to fear but a familiar presence in her reclaimed life. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady with the certainty of someone who had navigated the darkest waters and emerged stronger for the journey. "It's time to go home. My friends, we have reached the end of the story. Did you like it? What lesson can you take from this story? Leave it here in the comments. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and watch this video playing on your screen. This story will impact you. See you next time.